Are you building a business with the end in mind? Whether you're years away from selling or just beginning to think about it, today's episode will equip you with the tools to exit your business on your own terms and with the full value you deserve. David Flores Wilson, a certified exit planning advisor and award winning financial strategist, shares the biggest mistake business owners make when exiting, how to determine the true value of your business, and how to boost its appeal to buyers. Tune in to learn how to design a profitable exit plan that doesn't disrupt your day to day operations.
Welcome to Biz Help for You, the show that saves you the expensive learning curve by providing advice from industry experts in every facet of the entrepreneurial journey. Too many small businesses collapse. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 20% fail within their first year, and less than 35% make it to their 10th anniversary. The goal of this podcast is to change that statistic. So if you're interested in learning more to be a successful entrepreneur, tune in today.
So, David, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Kenny. Looking forward to the conversation.
I am looking forward to this conversation too. It's definitely important for people to think about. Often they might wait a little bit too late before they're ready to exit, or maybe they don't even have an exit plan at all. So I would love to really go into that topic with you. But before I get into questions I have on the topic, I'd love for you just to say, what made you decide to help entrepreneurs actually create successful business exit plans in the first place?
Sure. Me personally, I grew up in Guam, was born and raised there. And on weekends and summers, I spent a lot of time working for my grandparents' family businesses, right? So they had a series of family businesses, and I was exposed to kind of the different businesses they had. And what I saw was that they were hardworking, they were pillars of the community, but what they didn't have were the right advisors, right? And so they made some horrible decisions. They didn't have the right coverages, and there was a lawsuit, and they lost one of their businesses. They didn't have the proper estate plan in place, and so when they passed, their estate was tied up in probate for many years. And so, for me, it's really a personal mission, really to make sure that entrepreneurs and business owners don't make those mistakes, right? And so that they can thrive in their businesses and with their families and serve the communities that they serve. And so we go through our checklists and our different systems and processes to make sure that people are optimizing and in terms of exiting and their finances and all sorts of other things. So.
Well, and in my comments, right after I introduced you, of course, too, I said, I know a lot of times people wait too long to even think about this, planning. And I would love for you to maybe comment from your perspective. Why do you think that is that they wait, and what risks does that incur if they're waiting too long?
Yeah, let's face it, business owners they're busy and they're tied in a lot of different directions. And so, the concept of doing exit planning, it seems so overwhelming to most people, right? I think, because it's true, right? There's many different aspects to it, right? There's getting the business sort of ready, getting the business more attractive. There's sort of personal work that people have to get ready in terms of just, okay, are they personally ready psychologically? Do they have something to move on to? And then there's a financial piece of it, right? And so, doing all those things at the same time, it's very overwhelming. And so oftentimes we're saying, hey, let's chip away at the issue, start many years ahead of time. And, it's not just about the exit. We can potentially, it's good business, right? We can make a more valuable business. We can have a more fulfilling mission if we kind of do all this work. And so, it's tough to sort of think about that next phase and think about these potential changes that you might have to make to the business or some of the processes that you're doing. And so there's a lot of different barriers, and it's very common. And I think as an exit planner, it's my job to sort of just to educate and to be available, to be helpful. And when the owner is ready, then let's walk down that path, but we can go slowly, right? And so other people, we don't want to get in the situation where, because of a health reason or otherwise, we got to move so quickly and we got to make a lot of decisions, and we won't be able to optimize in those situations. So, the extent we can and kind of chip away at it. From the formation of the business, in some ways, people are doing some exit planning, whether it's the entity type or the different decisions you make along the way. And so, doing exit planning over the course of many years in a measured way makes most sense for most owners.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I've seen a few examples even in, my helping with customers. And unfortunately, someone passes away and there wasn't a plan. And I think they thought, I have plenty of time left. I'll get to it, later. And I'm only, certain age, and unfortunately, something happened. One was relatively young, but he had a heart attack, and one was COVID, and he was in the hospital for many, many months, and then, never actually was able to leave the business. And in both of those situations, the wives were stuck trying to deal with taking care of getting it sold as quickly as possible without losing value. But that didn't really happen because it was urgent and things weren't set up, and it was mainly they were the main person in the business, so there was not much of a business to sell if they didn't have someone in there to run it. So those are some of the things I had seen in recent years, and it makes me sad to think about, like, if they had taken the time to plan something and have some what if scenarios, then it might have turned out a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's so devastating, the loss of a spouse or a family member, and to throw that on top of, like, oh, by the way, you weren't in the business, and now you have to sort of deal with the business and get it ready for the sale. It can be challenging for the owners themselves who know the business so well to do that when they have a lot of runway. So as well, there could be real value destruction with unplanned sales, and so. Because buyers know it. Buyers know when they have a more informed seller. The buyers know when they have a more prepared seller, and oftentimes it's sort of those delays or just kind of hiccups in the process that can kill deals, right? And so, and you'll just get better outcomes to the extent that we've done a lot of the prep work and all these conversations around exit planning in advance.
Mm-hmm. So what are the kind of most common mistakes you see if someone is, really trying to sell their company now, or maybe they want to step away from the business, but they don't quite have everything, in place? What are those mistakes and how can they avoid them?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's some of it's mindset, right? I think oftentimes owners are focused on the income that they can derive from the business now, rather than the value of the business. And so, um, in addition to that, I think oftentimes when it comes to exit planning, an owner might have something in their mind around the particular exit route that they want to take without knowing sort of the full spectrum of options or the pros and cons. It really is the preferences of the owner and the stakeholders they really care about that often drives what the successful exit plan will be, right? For example, if they just want the maximum amount of proceeds, well, that might be a sale to a private equity buyer, right? Where a private equity platform will kind of roll up similar businesses in that industry and kind of get a higher multiple for doing that. And so they might be able to pay more than, let's say, an ESOP, or selling the business to a family member or a management buyout. But there could be situations where the owner, their legacy is so important. Their name on the door, the impact on the community, their management team, their employees. And so there's certain buyers where, that's going to be less a concern for the buyer, right? The buyers say, hey, you know what? We want to maximize our EBITDA. And so we're going to have some layoffs. We're going to change the name. And we've seen owners horrified, right? After, what is, technically a successful financial deal. But a year later, there's a tremendous amount of regret because they didn't sort of think through the pros and cons of that particular outcome. And so we never want clients to be blindsided by the transaction, in the years afterwards, and sort of the ramifications of going that exit route. And so that's a huge issue, I think, when they don't really understand the full spectrum of options and what that means in terms of pros and cons.
Well, and you use a term that most probably know what it means, but some may not. So can you define ESOP?
Sure. An ESOP is a employee stock ownership plan, and essentially the way to think about an ESOP is it is a retirement plan that essentially buys the shares from the owner, and then that retirement plan will own those shares. And so, why would you do that, right? Well, one, ESOP companies oftentimes outperform non-ESOP companies because all of a sudden that essentially a retirement plan owns those shares and then will distribute out those shares over time to the employees. And so you have a company that's highly incentivized and all incredible ownership throughout the company. And so that's sort of one of the main features of ESOPs. There are also a lot of tax benefits for the owners themselves. And so when they sell to the ESOP structure, there's ways to sort of mitigate capital gains, based on, the owner could have a very low cost basis, sell it to the ESOP, and then not pay capital gains on, potentially a big portion of their shares for a long period of time. As well, if the structure is done in the correct way, well, the business itself actually becomes a tax-free entity, and it can grow as it's not paying taxes as that sort of pension plan. And so I'll put these things together. It can be a very attractive in certain situations, right? You got to have the right type of company and the right kind of culture, and in general, earnings and cash flow can't be too volatile. And so, and then I think the flip side of that is because there's always a flip side to every option, is that legally the ESOP can't pay more than market value, right? And so it can't come in like maybe a potential strategic competitor or customer or supplier could come in and they really want that business, they're willing to overpay, but the trustees of that ESOP can't overpay. And so frankly, what we see sometimes is people start to go the ESOP route, they get a valuation from that, and they may pivot to a different type of transaction, given the universe of buyers out there and what they're willing to pay. So.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking before about, don't wait too long. Make sure you have plenty of time, to put a plan into place before you're planning to retire. So do you want to talk about, what do you think the minimum number of years is for someone to have to put a plan into place, make sure things are where they need to be? Because maybe today, if they're looking at the business, it's not where it needs to be. So how long really should they be implementing something? And is there a top end where it's too soon to really start thinking about it? If you're thinking it's 10, 15, 20 years down the line, at what point is it too many years to start planning?
Sure. I'd say to get a lot of the bulk of the planning done in a just in time for the transaction to happen, oftentimes it's sort of 2 to 5 years right before an actual transaction, and that way there's this certain amount of time that we can make business improvements, improve processes and systems, look at all sort of the different risks, whether that's on the technology side or on the legal side, get these sort of, the books in order, maybe want to get quality of earnings reports in. And so then, that's a fair amount of time. I think that, I do think that being exposed to some of the concepts of exit planning, no matter what stage of the business you are, it's sort of never too early, because I think that many owners know this, but they may not know that oftentimes a buyer will be willing to pay more. Certain things are in place, right? If you have systems and you have standard operating procedures and all your sort of different departments are running smoothly, and the owner is not so central to all the ins and outs of the business, right? For example, if the owner has, their CEO and they manage all the supplier relationships and their head of sales, and that isn't a business that a buyer can kind of come in and run from day one. And so building out that management team, which will take additional expense and possibly impact cash flow in the near term, is something that they might want to consider, right? So they may not implement some of those plans for many years, but I think even from formation, owners should be aware of some of these concepts if
Mhm.
selling their business is something that they want to do. So,
Right. Well, like I said, if the owner is making all the decisions and everything has to come through them, number one, they're a bottleneck in the first place, right? Because the business
yeah.
can't efficiently run if everything has to come through them. But like you're saying, people who want to invest in the company, they don't want to invest in a job, right? They want to have an investment. And so if somebody has to be there, if the owner's thinking, okay, I'm going to sell my business and then be out of it, I'm going to retire, who's going to step in and do all of the things, right?
Yeah. No, I was just talking to a client of mine the other day, and we've been encouraging to build out their management team as their balance sheet and their business has grown. They're in the hospitality business, and they've looked at acquisitions before, and it's a multi-generation family business, and the first generation is highly skeptical towards acquisitions. They actually use those words themselves, right? They're like, oh well, like, are we buying another property or are we buying a job, right?
Mhm.
And it doesn't have to be that way, right? Because I think that if we have the management in place and we have our systems, well, then it isn't just you're not expanding the business and just deducting from your time.
Mhm.
It's there's real synergies once we have that management in place. So.
Mhm. So if someone is, let's say there's a sole proprietor or husband wife team or something, it's a family business, let's say too, and they haven't really looked at bringing in outside management yet and creating a C-suite team or whatever that might be, like how do they even start that process of looking for someone? It's different when you're just hiring an employee to bring someone in who's going to do a certain job that you already know how to do too, and maybe you're delegating. But maybe this is something where I don't know how to hire someone in a management position and how to have them take over some of those tasks. What would you encourage them to do to get that process started?
Yeah, because it's a different set of skills, right? I mean, you're able to do it yourself versus sort of managing the team that does that. Um, if you've already sort of done the strategic analysis and that is something you want to do and it is sort of best for the business long term, frankly, we encourage business owners to build that team or at least communities as well of other business owners where they can kick around some of these ideas, so that they can learn from some of the mistakes that other people make, before they sort of make their own mistakes when it comes to building out that team. So we're big fans of just, okay, well, let's get you into these sort of different groups, whether that's EO, Entrepreneurs Organization, or Vistage, or something, some other sort of community where you can trade ideas, maybe even in people outside your industry, so that way you can kind of bring some of these ideas and best practices into your business, without sort of talking directly to a competitor, right? So.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's just going to be one of the things that people struggle with is figuring out how to bring in someone to help them manage and maybe even let go of some of that control too, I mean, I had seen that as an example too. My grandfather, he's the only person in my family that's been an entrepreneur that I know of, and he had run a business for a very long time and thought his son would take over, and then he had a very hard time letting go of control, and finally the son was like, forget it, like, I'm out of here. Right, and then he had to
Yes.
sell it to someone who was a total stranger, and it was still hard to let go of control, right? So I think it might be hard to even bring in management if you're trying to build that team and actually allow them to take over. You're not necessarily going to agree on everything, So what do you say to that person too, who wants to build a management team, but also maybe it's been their baby for so long, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle?
Yeah, no, I think this is interesting, right? And this is the the struggles of succession generally. These are tales as old as time, right? And so we've had the chance to sort of been advisory on several different successful successions, and each one's a little bit different, right? And I think you kind of start with the values, right? And you start to say, okay, well, what do I want as a family? What do I want as a business? And then you kind of work from there, right? And I think that there's sort of a leadership development track that's super important if you're thinking about children being in the business. And there's all sorts of best practices to thinking, okay, well, maybe I require that they work outside the business, outside the family business for 5 or 7 years, and then they come in with sort of confidence and new skills and a fresh perspective. And so I think that if this is done right, and the companies that are able to have board of directors, this is a little bit easier, right? Because that's a set of advisors, and if there's governance in place that can keep them accountable about what are the responsibilities that leader has, who would be an appropriate next generation leader, what skills would they need, would they need a different type of leader given the changes in the industry, and being very deliberate about that. But if it's a sole owner without a board, this is a much more challenging situation, right? Because it takes a lot of self-awareness. It takes a lot of trust. But there's ways to do this where you can imagine a situation where it's a second generation who's working in the business and is the probable successor. And so you can start to write down, okay, well, what is the leader doing every day, right? What are they understanding? And so if they're, looking over the operations and running HR, and then also managing the capital relationships, well, what can we kind of take off that leader's plate? Just kind of one by one. There could be a dozen or so things that they're working on, and one by one sort of just saying, hey, okay, let's give this task and this leadership role to this next generation. Okay, well, they did a good job there. Well, let's expand their responsibilities. Because I think there's kind of lots of different ways to do this, but I think if you're intentional, because sometimes it's like, okay, well, we want them working in different departments and then eventually coming up, or maybe just kind of focusing in on one particular area or one division of the business. And so there's lots of different ways. Different families have been successful doing this, but I think the theme when families successfully do this is that there's a plan and there's open communication and real alignment of expectations, because it's not just okay, well, this is you're required to run this business one day, or you're expected to yet is it attractive from the second generation's perspective too? Is that what's best for their career? And so I also, I'm jumping around a little bit, is that when it comes to succession, the control of the business and the operations of the business, and then the ownership of the business, those are kind of two different things, right? And then you can imagine situations where ownership is transferred, but responsibilities aren't, or other situations where responsibilities are transferred, but that first generation, okay, well, like I still want control of the actual shares. And so, and it's really just understanding the parties involved. There's lots of sort of family business consultants that can help as well. I think that as an advisor, I always want to be careful, because I love to save money on taxes and I love a good financial strategy, but sometimes these things can kind of backfire too, right? And like we want to. Sometimes an example of that is sometimes we want to give shares to the next generation so we can, for estate planning purposes, but it may not be appropriate yet, right? That next generation might not be ready to be a real owner because they don't understand what ownership means yet in terms of stewardship and responsibility. So, you got to consider all these different factors.
Well, and you were just saying too, like, I love to save on taxes too. And I know that's what most people want, but I know too, if you're planning on selling, that could backfire as well too, because now your business isn't seen as valuable too. So do you want to touch on that? Like the balance between, showing your profitability, trying to limit taxes, having the value there that is going to make it attractive for someone who's going to come and buy from you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that most buyers understand that there is a big element of owners running personal expenses through the business, right? Or, whether that's people on the payroll that are not maybe even working full time, or vacations or company cars that are really personal expenses. And so it's part of the process to really identify what those expenses are. And the timing of which, when you're like, oh no, let's, oftentimes, the buyer will, like, you'll see these sort of add backs and adjustments to cash flow. But I do think that sometimes it's owners, it's a little short-sighted to always just saying, hey, what, I want to run a business that minimizes taxes to such a great degree that you're not showing any sort of profitability. At the same time, the buyers recognize they can make these adjustments. Because you buy a business, it's essentially like you're going to run your own P&L, right? Like you're going to have your own cost structure. And I think sometimes like when I advise sellers and the buyers sort of saying, oh, you're not that profitable, or like based on these expenses, I'm like, well, aren't you going to change this whole expense base anyways, right? Like you're going to run a like let's just so you got to always look at it from the buyer's perspective when you're even when you're the seller as well, right? To get the most out of your leverage.
So if they're going to be selling their company, especially if it's to like an outside investor, maybe who hasn't had, any knowledge of the business before in terms of working in the company, like what should they expect in terms of an agreement for like how long they have to stay in the business? Like a lot of people probably think, oh, I'm going to sign on the dotted line, I'm going to get paid and I'm out of here, right? But what is typical in terms of how long an owner should be staying in the business, being expected to kind of help with that transition? And then is there additional compensation for that, or is that part of just the sales price generally?
Yeah, and it depends on industry to industry and the type of business it is. But in general, whether it's through an earnout or a consulting agreement or a non-compete, oftentimes, some of the seller's proceeds will be in that compensation, and so it's all kind of a big negotiation, right? In terms of just, I've seen people say, you know what, I'm not sticking around. And the business is what it is, and guess what? I mean, the price was lower, right? And so the buyers are highly sophisticated. They do a lot of deals. They've seen a lot of owners, and so sellers should be aware that and hire their own sophisticated advisors to sort of for them to kind of just run it and negotiate directly. There's just so many different types of so many different areas in which are up for negotiation. And so you want to find the buyer that's kind of right for you in terms of all those kind of different areas, right? In terms of what you care about. If you're tired and need to go, most buyers that are sort of expecting an earnout or you to be available, they might give you a little haircut on that. But oftentimes, what's happening a lot is these transactions are being done with sort of rollover equity, right? So you sort of you get a certain amount of the proceeds in the new entity, or you might get bonuses or additional compensation if you stay on and you hit certain metrics. But then just always know that incentives are always understanding the incentives is so important, right? Because even metrics can be manipulated, right? Because if you're, for example, like, oh yeah, if you have X amount of sales over the next couple of years, you get X amount more. But you can always think like, oh well, the company that bought you could actually just take the top performing salespeople and transfer them to another division or something like that, right? And so even metrics like sales, you think that can be manipulated. There can be unintended consequences. And so, yeah, just, having the right advisors, being upfront about what your preferences are is so important, right? And just, when you have a mismatch of what the buyer wants and what the seller is comfortable with, it could be a recipe for disaster for sure. Yeah.
Well, I know we are coming close to the end of the time that we have together. This has been very informative, but I wanted to ask, do you have an offer that you would like to extend to our listeners? And if they want more information, how can they find you and contact you?
Sure. Yeah, they can reach out to me on the website or the blog, on the blog Planning to Wealth. We can set up a time to have a free consultation, and we can chat about your particular situation. As well, there's lots of content on there for business owners, and whether it relates to exit planning and other financial planning issues.
Well, thank you for being a guest on my show, David. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed our discussion.
Great chatting with you today.
And to the listener, if you enjoyed today's topic and you want to hear additional information, you can find access to exclusive content in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in today. Would you please share this episode with those you know and leave a review on your favorite platform? And if you find our show informative, would you consider being a financial sponsor to help me continue my mission to educate business owners? A link is located in the episode description, and no amount is too small. I'd really appreciate your support. If you are interested in connecting with our guest and receiving the offer they had to share, a link to our resource page is in the show notes. Finally, if you have any bookkeeping or payroll needs, reach out to us at 310-534-5577 or contact@abandp.com. My team and I are eager to assist you. Until next time, have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Biz Help for You. Please join your host, Candy Messer, again next time. Have a terrific day.